Travillian Next is a division of Travillian, a financial services specialist search and talent advisory firm. Since inception, the Travillian team has dedicated itself to enhancing the return on investment of a company's most important resource, its people.
JP set the table, and now we're going to dig into some of the more nitty-gritty. That big picture, it requires other elements, technology, workers, people to execute that plan. So let's go to Stan. Stan, you're going to deal with kind of the master of talent acquisition himself, Brian Love. So I'll turn it to you.
Thanks. And talent is, to follow on what Justin said, talent is essential here, because when you look at it, a lot of banks, they use many of the same vendors, many of the same common core providers. So what separates banks is their talent. And for talent, we have Brian Love. Brian Love is a banker by trade. He's the head of Banking and Fintech at Travillian, which is an executive search and talent advisory firm for the financial services industry. Like I said, Brian started out in banking. He works with a lot of tech forward banks. He's helped a lot of our banks find the right people to get into different spots. And I see Brian at a lot of the same conferences all over. He lives, he breathes, he eats tech forward, fintech, and banking as a service. And we're lucky to have him here, and excited to hear what he has to say. But first, when I was talking to Brian the other day, Brian actually was able to talk to Michael Sue, the acting Comptroller of the currency, at a recent conference.
Yeah. Hello, everyone. Nice to be here. Can you see me and hear me? Awesome. Yes. So thank you for that intro, Stan. Before I get into the conference I was at with the acting Comptroller of the currency, I just want to say thank you for inviting me on. It's awesome to see my good friends there at Barack Ferrazzano, Justin and Stan, and it's nice to also follow up JP at Alloy. Big fans of those guys as well. But thank you for the intro. I was out in Vail, Colorado, and actually I was doing a presentation about BaaS to a room full of community banks. Some of them interested in it, some not at all. But right before, Michael Sue was on stage at a fireside chat talking about BaaS and crypto and all these other things. So I rushed up there to get a couple minutes with him. And the moral of the story is he used the words, it's been the Wild West for the last 5 years in BaaS land. But I said a lot of my clients are these BaaS banks. And I think this is a great way for our community banks, to add a ton of value and to innovate and to think differently. And he totally agreed. I felt like he was very bullish on the BaaS channel, but it's clear it's going to be potentially regulated a little bit differently. But that was actually a thrill. I mean, what other person gets excited to speak to the acting Comptroller of the currency? But that's me. I'm excitable.
No, thanks, Brian. And I think maybe the first question to start that, if you're a bank that's thinking about getting into banking as a service, who's the right person to start with? Because usually that idea comes from somebody at the bank, usually higher up the chain at the bank.
Yeah, that's true. And my first thought is you got to know who is kind of your ambassador for innovation. And there's some banks where it's not the CEO. It may not even be the CTO. It may be someone a little bit more junior. And you really have got to kind of catapult that person into your strategy planning. But you do see a lot of times the CEO, kind of harbors that urge to innovate. And I think the better question here to ask, Stan, is why would you get into BaaS? We get involved in deeply strategic conversations with boards, with community banks out there, and there's really two big drivers that I hear, and it's fee income. And 1 second on fee income, our awesome client JP mentioned them too, Coastal Community Bank in Seattle, Washington. They posted fee income of 1.4 million in June 2021. And June of this year, it jumped to 3.2 million because their number of fintech partners jumped from 12 to 23. So there's a correlation there, and there's substantial fee income. By the way, they've also vetted like 2,000 fintechs to get to that 23 plus. But they've got great fintech partners like Aspiration, and they're going to be the bank behind the Walmart initiative too, which is quite interesting. But the second thing that most banks want to get into is deposit growth, and it's kind of a 1A, 1B. It's not the same world. JP mentioned this. To get low cost deposits that you can then turn around and lend in your community with. You got credit unions, you got regional banks, you got national banks, and you've got these fintechs, these challenger banks, these neo banks that are grabbing their piece of the pie. So I guess my communication to this audience is, if you can't beat them, join them. You think of a bank, they're not a client of ours, but a bank like MVB Bank in West Virginia, they saw an opportunity to get involved with online gaming, DraftKings. Think of all the money that's sitting there in these accounts, and now they're the bank behind that. Their DDA savings interest-bearing deposits as of 2017 was 126 million, and it's 1.3 billion today. So that's 5 years of growth, and they've absolutely killed it. They are also behind Credit Karma, but these are just little stories. I think it was you, Justin, who said, or maybe it was JP. Well, every bank out here can do these things. You've really got to foster that innovation and talk through how to do it right. So I guess I kind of answered your question, Stan, but I went in my own direction there.
No, and so that the banks that are getting into it, what's sort of their initial talent search? And are they looking inside the bank or outside the bank?
Well, yeah, I mean, it's tough. You always want to assess current talent. I mean, with succession, with almost anything you do, the people that are working side by side with you, they understand the bank's culture. And when you bring someone new in, you stand the chance of maybe, kind of changing that culture a little bit. But I've talked to CEOs. I had a webinar earlier this year where one of the CEOs who is on our Tech Forward Bank Index, Travillian created kind of a grouping of banks that are innovating, BaaS, crypto, payments, et cetera. This particular CEO really said that it's almost impossible to repurpose existing staff. So I'd say 9 out of 10 banks are looking externally for talent in this space. And it is a very finite pool of candidates that we're talking to. We can get into that a little bit later.
And what I've seen, some of our banks, such as Lincoln Savings Banks and Choice Financial Group, that have been very successful with banking as a service so far, they have their own fintech divisions, like the Choice Fin at Choice and LSBX at Lincoln Savings Bank. Can you tell us about the banks that want to go down that approach of setting up a separate fintech division and how they staff that?
Yeah, no, that's interesting. How some banks, almost, I use the word bifurcate, right? When it comes down to, I'd say the number one search we're doing right now for our BaaS banks, surprise, it's risk and compliance. I mentioned my conversation with Michael Sue, and it's the buzzword right now, is compliance, third-party risk management, BSA. These are the things that banks really have always been focused on, but in this fintech realm, it's a little bit trickier. So in the context of your question, it's very difficult for banks to cannibalize existing risk and compliance talent. So what we've seen and what we've promoted is go out and create almost like an innovation compliance team. And we've helped a few mutual clients of Barack's and Travillian's in the kind of creation of a innovation compliance hierarchy. Lincoln Savings we've worked with as well, and they have a chief risk officer for the bank, but a lot of the attention is paid to their BaaS initiative because it's a lightning rod for compliance. And I guess I'll kind of move into some of the other areas, Stan, that we're hiring a ton for. That first one, and first and foremost, is compliance, of course, but we've also seen operations. These are integration, fintech relationship managers, project managers who can help onboard a fintech from start to finish, and then continue to kind of, create that or foster that relationship along the way. I think two others, one that's been kind of top of mind recently is business development roles. A lot of these banks are pretty dependent on middleware like Unit or Treasury Prime, Synctera, Synapse. These are all companies that have a ton of value for banks. But if you can attract folks who really understand the fintech ecosystem, the startups, the VCs, attorneys like you guys, investment bankers, Silicon Valley, the folks in Utah and Austin, and everyone that's really innovating, this could make you less dependent on vendors and put much more money in your pocket instead of dividing up that revenue with the middleware company. But I guess the third piece that I would tell you that Travillian is quite busy on is leadership. This is actually what we consider fintech presidents. And these are folks, we did it for Lincoln Savings Bank. Lincoln had this awesome team, and they've been doing it for longer than most banks. I think it's 7-8 years now that they onboarded their first fintech. And it was a tremendous team. But when you get to critical mass and you're banking 5, 10, 15, 20 fintechs, and it almost becomes your number one money-making line, almost the identity of your bank, there comes a point where your CEO is maybe stretched a little thin. There's got to be someone installed who can oversee that fintech line. And if I had any advice for banks that are jumping into fintech, you're going to reach that point at some point. You've got the ability now to start with a great leader who can outline ops, risk, BD, business development, credit, all those pieces that will affect your banking as a service division. So, yeah, and Stan, I'll let you jump in here, but the one last thing I was going to say is when we helped Coastal Community Bank hire Kurt Carews earlier this year, it was clear that their current CEO, Eric, he was better utilized in other ways. He's a tremendous leader. So he actually bifurcated his title and gave the president title to Kurt. Kurt oversees the bank and parts of CCBX, which is their fintech division. So that's, there's definitely some restructuring that needs to happen when roles like this are hired.
No, that is fascinating. And one trend that we've seen, and I don't know if you've seen too, is that we had a bunch of banks, some of the early movers in banking as a service that built up programs. And unfortunately, they had some of their employees leave for the big shining ball of the fintech. But we've seen sort of a trend where those employees are coming back to banks from the fintech. And I sort of want to lead into, so what is as we sit here in October 2022, what is the market for banks that are looking for fintech talent to staff their banking as a service operations?
Yeah, well, it's been a crazy year, market-wise and for fintechs. This has been a tough year for fintechs. And I think the neobanks and challenger banks out there, they're having tough times. So I do feel like there is a level of stability at a bank. Banks are generally very well capitalized right now. I know there's a lot of murmurs of what the future will bring, but I do feel like, one of the best kept secrets for fintech talent, for tech forward talent, as I call it, these are people at fintechs, at tech companies, and other places that are, kind of bordering into financial services. I think one of the best kept secrets is that a community bank, generally, I think you guys may agree too, is one of the most genuine cultures that you'll ever see in the workplace. These are banks that absolutely make it imperative that their employees enjoy working there. These are banks and companies that get best places to work year in, year out. And these fintechs and public companies sometimes, it's quarterly. There's kind of a grind. Not that there's not a grind at privately held or your BaaS tech forward banks, but it's just a different environment. It's nurturing, it's fun. It's what banking used to be. It's kind of like when I jumped to community banking earlier in my career, I said, this is amazing. And now I get to be, helping these great, fantastic cultured community banks, growing their talent bench. But I will tell you that the war for talent is real in this space. I mean, it is so finite to find the right risk and compliance talent that understands tech and banking. That is a subset of a subset. Because even just regular banks are looking for risk and compliance people. And then you've got to drill down and find folks that really understand how fintechs operate, how, how to onboard them and how to, continue to service them well. It's a very, very small world out there. I think this talent too, and, is really much more excited to work remotely. Fintechs generally have adapted that environment even pre-pandemic. They were okay with some remote, but now they've leaned into it completely. So that is something that needs to be kind of thought through when we start a search with a bank. A lot of banks still want to have leaders elbow to elbow in the office. I think this talent, if you're going to, potentially recruit it, you may need to kind of modify your work from home strategies. And then, I think like Lincoln Savings Bank, for instance, when we helped them with their fintech president, they were able to look beyond Iowa, which, sorry, Iowa, it's not the most tech forward place. There is tech there, but they were able to increase coast to coast. And we actually found a candidate in Portland who was working at a bank in New Jersey. This is a person who built his own fintech at one point, who came up in banking. This kind of supports my thesis that if you find folks that understand banking and technology, and they have elements of risk, compliance, and business development, that could be an absolute knockout to lead your division. So those are some of my thoughts there, Stan.
So when you find someone like that for one of your banks that you think that you think's a good fit, when the bank's about to interview this person, how do you structure that interview? Do you treat it differently than hiring some type of other employee?
Well, there's
how
no
does
denying.
The bank sell itself to the candidate?
It's a great question, and there's no denying that tech-forward talent can sniff out a few things right off the bat. And our job at Travillian, if it boils down to one word, it's storytelling. So even before candidates are brought live to our clients, we spend copious amounts of time with our clients' executive team, sometimes board members, especially with the fintech president roles, to make sure that we craft and storytell the right way about your bank. And then once that candidate is brought to the fray, we make sure that we, kind of give our opinions of who should be the first face and, maybe what that conversation should look like. There was a particular bank that had someone who I wouldn't consider tech forward as being their first interview. And it was tough for me to communicate it, but it was the right move to actually supplant that person and put that bank's head of innovation as the first interview. I mean, there's just no denying that conversation sells a candidate a little bit more. It helps them understand their ecosystem within that bank a little more, and just drives that interest. And then over time, that person who was supplanted was then put back into the interview process. But I will tell you, tech-forward candidates can sniff out a lack of commitment. There's some banks, and maybe not so much anymore, but there's some banks that just kind of their pinky toes in the pool of BaaS and innovation. Just because it's cool or someone else is doing it, or maybe they want to just bank one fintech. That's not sustainable for a big-time candidate. A candidate wants to be able to build something. And even once they've built it and it's flying and it's going well, they want to be able to maybe help other parts of the bank and their innovation, lending and operations, and drive efficiencies and automation and things like that. So if you're trying to attract good innovation talent, especially at a senior level, those are some of the things that you've got to be thinking about. This can't just be a finite project because 2 years later, that person's a flight risk. And so I would absolutely tell banks to create a BaaS strategy that has a 1, 3, 5, maybe 7 year plan. That's critical. And of course, Travillian can help you think through that, but that really starts at the top. And so, yeah, those are some of my thoughts, Stan.
So if you're you're talking to the candidates. You have a great candidate. They've gone through it. The interview process going great. Let's talk about compensation and benefits for these folks. How is that different from, say, the core bank? Like, what do you have to do to get those people on board at the bank?
Yeah, it's a loaded question. I mean, every bank is a little different, but so I'll speak kind of in generalities. I've talked about this fintech president role. I mean, this person generally slots in like at a public bank in their proxy. I would say it's got to be a top 5 position. You do see chief innovation officers, things like that. They slot in the top 5 of a bank. I mean, let's be honest, back to JP's presentation, this is how banks are going to be sustainable for the next, decades to come, almost transforming into tech companies. So there's no denying that there is a premium for this talent. Now consider this. If these candidates are coming from fintechs, neobanks, challenger banks, larger tech-forward banks, like a Cross River or a Live Oak or a Signature or Silvergate or whatever you want to call it, they've probably already established a certain level of compensation. At fintechs too, there's almost a kind of I don't want to say a mirage, but equity is a huge piece at fintechs. And so that is something I do believe truly entrepreneurial tech forward talent is looking for, is skin in the game. And maybe that's more cash heavy, maybe that's equity laden, but that's something I do tend to think is going to help you land really good talent. So I will just say, I mean, at the beginning of any search, Stan, we always have, kind of a powwow with our client about comp. And it's a difficult conversation. But more so than maybe any recruiting firm out there, and I don't mean to boast, we do have really good understanding of comp in the BaaS space. Compliance, operations, and leadership. We do give live comp data that is of the moment to our clients to let them know, like, this is what it costs. And if we have to maybe maneuver a little bit and try and poach, a number 2 or a number 3 instead, that's more emerging, that is a little bit more in line with their budgetary, ideas, we can do that. But I do think that for the most part, then that person has to kind of grow up on the job. So my overarching
which
theme
might
here,
not be the best in every single situation.
Well, no, it might not. And because, you think about some of the issues happening at certain banks out there, you can't afford to mess this up, on a risk side, on an ops side, you got to get it right on the first swing. So I do feel like that's the one thing as you get into this BaaS pool, there are premiums you need to think about. And, really pedigree is everything. If you recruit from the best, you've got to kind of compensate like the best. I guess it really boils down to that a lot.
And going back to what you said earlier, but I really like the idea is that for the right type of people in the in the fintech or BaaS division, whatever you want to call it, the bank, is that they know that they have some skin in the game, that if they succeed, if their efforts succeed, they will be rewarded and they'll be definitely able to build that. So and I think that sort of rolls in. I may have answered my own question here. So what do you think are the best character traits amongst your most successful candidates?
Well, actually, just let me say one last thing about comp is we do see a lot of times a correlation on the bonus plan between revenue from the fintech division and the amount of non-guaranteed compensation that the candidate gets. That's sometimes very dangerous. I know some banks that have put those plans together and they've paid their fintech leaders well more than the CEO will ever make. I mean, extraordinary amounts of money. It gets you into a situation where you may need to kind of like redevelop a new contract, and that's never a good idea. But I just wanted, just like a commercial lender, the output of revenue correlates to the bonus. I think that's a good way to do it.
You successful, in other words.
Yeah, and you heard some of the numbers I mentioned with Coastal and with MVB. I mean, there's extraordinary amounts of income and revenue that come with well-run BaaS divisions. But to your question, you asked me what character traits do I see among successful candidates in this realm? And if there's one word that comes to mind, it's entrepreneurial. You know, it's almost, you know, they think about this line of business as it's their own business. And that really separates what I think good talent from bad talent is someone who's not dependent on administration and other things. You know, they're an entrepreneur, they're plunging the toilets one day and they're, you know, maybe writing code the next day. I'm being kind of dramatic on both sides of that, but you know what I mean? They're doing everything. They run their business like it's their business. So with that being said, one extension of that is, can we find somebody who maybe did run a business, ran a fintech at one point in their career? They understand that whole ecosystem. They understand how that company operates, the P&L, the people, the collaboration. But the anomaly is finding someone who also understands banking. And I'm kind of like a skipping record here, but regulations, operational flow. Go ahead. I'm sorry.
No. And, you know, it's so funny that you say that because, you know, some of our banks, it comes to mind, some of the talent that they've hired have actually come from fintechs that have been ironically purchased by other banks. And we recently were helping a client that was a non-bank actually considering investing in the fintech. And we were doing due diligence on the fintech with its relationship with its BaaS provider. And it was interesting that this fintech specifically hired compliance people that had banking experience. So you saw it where it sort of goes both ways, and it almost seems like it's really you might have your most successful mix where you've had people that work both at the fintech and at the bank, whether they're at the fintech or they're at the bank, where they have all that experience combined together.
Yeah, that's kind of an interesting thing, how you got fintechs grabbing bankers, you got bankers grabbing fintech people, but I think the answer is somewhere right in between. And what I will say, and again, Lincoln Savings, Coastal, the work we've done with both of those banks as well as several other BaaS banks. Again, everyone who's listening to this, community banks can attract this talent. With the right storytelling and the right commitment, you can go out and get some of the best, most entrepreneurial talent to run these divisions. I mean, that's what Travillian knows. We have this, you know, great network of folks. This talent is interested in your community bank in the middle of Iowa, believe it or not. You know, this bank, this talent is looking for a better place to work in 2022 going into 2023. They're challenging environments across the board, and I think community banks are a great landing spot for this talent.
Oh, that is great. Thank you so much for those insights, Brian. And you're right. This is a new area where you have to have new ideas, and new ideas often require new talent, sometimes from outside the bank. But talent alone won't lead to success. You also need to devote resources to technology, which brings us to our next speaker, Justin. Thanks.